Hello and welcome to this webinar entitled Breaking Boundaries, Unconscious Bias and Social Inclusion After the COVID-19 Pandemic. My name is Alex Mejia. I am a Division Director at UNITAR, and I take great pleasure in welcoming everyone to this webinar that we have co-organized with the Bahçeşehir University in Turkey, BAU, that is a close partner and a strategic ally of our organization. BAU co-host one of the 21 training centers around the world called CIFAL. So CIFAL Istanbul is duly represented today as well, and we welcome the audience that join us in Turkey and in some other countries. Before we begin, we wanted to tell you that this webinar is organized very much aware of what has been happening during the COVID pandemic and is still happening during this pandemic in terms of unconscious bias. We have seen an escalation on it, and we believe that it would be a good idea to discuss it. We have outstanding experts today that I will introduce at the proper time, and we also thank them for their willingness to join us at UNITAR for the organization of this event. With that, allow me to begin the presentation, please. Next. Very good. So as you can see on the screen, we have here a presentation on the total number of countries and territories infected by coronavirus. And it's very sad to say the UN has 193 member states. All of our member states, all of the countries of the world have been infected. There is no one spared by this pandemic. And in addition to that, several self-governing or depending territories are also there. The number you see on the screen is 216 as of 8 July. Next, please. On this slide, you are going to see how the number increased before. How the number increased. When we began a series of webinars in the second half of March, we started with approximately less than 200,000 cases, and today, as of yesterday, we have almost 12 million, 11.9 million. You see on this slide that there is an exponential curve that unfortunately does not stop. It's been several months since the outbreak in East Asia at the end of last year. But the sad news behind these 12 million people infected is the number of deaths. And the number of deaths indeed is a drama in itself. In each particular case is one too many deaths, because the numbers that you have seen in the previous slide affects every family. It's not just one person that has been infected and unfortunately passed away, but it's a global drama that we are living in. And also on the slide that you have in front of you, you will see that as of yesterday, we have 135,000 new cases. Very sad indeed. Next, please. On this slide, and Sebastian, I will need you to come closer to me because it's taking a while for the slides to change. But we simply wanted to give you a overview to the right on the in a relative manner on how the COVID performs or behaves in comparison to other diseases. You will see that it's not necessarily the higher case fatality as in Ebola, MERS, smallpox, and it's also not necessarily the highest reproduction capacity, because that would be chickenpox, but it's right in the middle. So it's a virus that somehow, even though it's aggressive, but it's not as aggressive as others, creates this global havoc with this ability to be transmitted airborne from human to human. To the left, you see that we have this virus, the coronavirus, has a higher reproduction rate than the flu, 1.5 times or 2 times. That 17% of the cases of coronavirus are severe, so they require oxygen, but not necessarily an intubation. But then that 5% of all the cases are actually critical. They require ventilation, an intubation into a ventilator, And of course, that is a lot higher than the figures that are normally observed with the flu. The sad part, as we were saying before, is that 4 to 5% of the cases will end in demise. The person will pass away. The mortality rate is that between 4 and 5% as reported by the WHO. And if you compare that with the seasonal influenza, there is really a long distance. Seasonal influenza, as you see, there is below 0.1%, not 1%, but 0.1%. Next, please. I cannot see the next slide, but I do remember it's taking a while. It was the total confirmed cases of COVID. Now I see the total confirmed cases of COVID-19. And in those lines, we simply wanted to exemplify, as of July 7th, the case of the United States. Our headquarters, of course, is in New York, and we have closely followed the evolution of the pandemic in New York State and the surrounding states. And even though that has improved, the rest of the vast majority of the states of the United States of America are still in a growth mode. So you see this exponential evolution, now surpassing 2.5 million and close to 3 is affecting the US. And the case of India is also worrisome somehow. But then you have the case of the European countries, the UK, Spain, Italy, Switzerland, and so on, with curves that are being flattened. We see at the Palais des Nations in Geneva, Switzerland, and I can tell you that if you were to go on the street, it would be pretty normal. Social distancing as a mindset in itself is reducing very fast. It's disappearing actually very fast. And even though the Swiss government, always very precise, is recommended keeping social distancing, is the European summer. So people are not necessarily doing that in Switzerland or the rest of Europe. That has led some people to think that indeed there should be a second wave of the coronavirus with the relaxing of the measures and the social distancing. We don't know that yet, but it is very much likely that we will see as more increase. Next, please. On this slide, kind of a convoluted amalgamation of lines, you will see horizontally that the outbreak in China at the end of last year, and then fast forward the outbreak in Korea, and then the outbreak in Italy, the days after the initial event were actually short. And we have seen that the pandemic actually became a global issue out of a Chinese issue. And that is, of course, history now, but it's important to remember how fast this evolved, and it surpassed any preparation or readiness that any health system will have in other countries. But the graph there needs simply to exemplify how this public health issue has very fast become a social crisis and an economic crisis. And this is an indicator of such, of the last one, because there you have all the curves of the behavior of the major stock markets in the world, excluding, I think, the US. And then you will see that in the major affected countries, the economy fell the virus outbreak. Countries in Asia, which is what you see here, experience more negative and normal returns as compared with other countries. However, the equity markets are, as of now, slowly rebounding. Next, please. In this slide, you can see that while the coronavirus has indeed become also or created, fostered in an economic crisis, we don't know exactly how the global economy is going to perform. However, the chief economist of the International Monetary Fund, Dr. Gopinath, has said correctly, so in our opinion, that the great lockdown, which is easing now in some countries, will indeed result in the worst recession since the Great Depression, and this is almost a century ago. And if you compare two numbers, the projection now for the great lockdown in this year that we are living in, the year 2020. We will expect, and the IMF will expect that approximately 3.5% will be the decrease in the GDP growth year on year. But if you compare that, I was saying, with the global financial crisis of 2009, the global decrease was 0.1%, not even 1%, so a humongous difference. Next, please. The recovery, as you will see on your screen, will take a while. This projection does not envisions a second wave of the coronavirus, especially in the global north. However, it does take into consideration what is happening in the United States of America, where this debate is raging on whether to open the economy fully or to continue preventive measures and a lockdown. Regardless of that, the forecast is that the cumulative output loss will be of $9 trillion with a T, and that the economy in 2021 will need to rebound 5.8% to recover what has happened. As of April 2020, we will see that the biggest dip in the average economic growth will have happened, and because some economies are indeed opening and global trade has somehow resumed similar patterns as before the pandemic, we believe that this will be eased. The global economy will recover in the third and fourth quarter, but that, if I may say, could also be understood as a positive outlook. Next, please. Now, all of this, from a global health crisis to a global social crisis to a global economic crisis, necessarily for us at the United Nations and in any given government, will need to be analyzed from the point of view of public policy and lessons learned. And this is an ongoing pandemic, so there's still a lot to see, but there are lessons learned already. And from our perspective at the United Nations, we simply postulate that interagency coordination at the national level and harmonization at the regional and global level must become a priority. It's very difficult in such an interconnected world to think that a country basically completely closes borders and basically that's it, is isolated. Because sooner or later, there are vulnerabilities that are exploited by the virus, and if the relaxing of the lockdown measures start, the exposure, of course, increases. Now, at the UN, and you will allow us to say this thing because you know how much we have been invested in bringing sustainable development to all, particularly to developing nations. We issue a call to remember that the objectives established in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development are still valid, and that they should become the basis and reason for all public policy. The fight, the global fight against poverty, the strengthening of educational sectors, of health sectors indeed, which is the focus now, infrastructure and the like, the protection of the environment, of course, remain a priority. And for us, public policy have to take that into consideration. Next, please. You will see that we have several conceptions of what will be the next normal. The coronavirus pandemic has indeed created a completely new normal that we really don't know how it's going to come out. We see already a new normal, but it's still evolving. But regardless of how that new normal will be, hopefully soon, when the pandemic recedes and decreases, or a global vaccine is actually found and the trials are successful and it's administered to the populations. Until that happens, this is still a fluid new normal. However, the R's that you see stated in this slide remain. We have seen the resolve of humankind as a whole. We have seen the resilience of governments and civil society in light of the population. And remember that resilience is understood in several fashions. The one that I like the most, if I may say, my wife and I have 3 daughters, and I got that question once from one of them from high school, and I couldn't think of a better analogy than this. Resilience is what happens when the wind really blows over a tree, and the tree is bended and some branches are indeed bended almost to the point of break, but then the wind decreases. And that branch has the ability, and the tree as a whole, to go back to what it was in its original position. So resilience from that point of view is indeed something that has been addressed with several public policy being implemented, including on the management of the economy, and also on social issues. So there are already several countries implemented, not so fast, please, go back. Several countries implementing employment protection measures, social security protection measures, subsidies and the like, to maintain, to be able to go back to what the original scenario was before the pandemic. But then you see the other art, which is the return. The return is how we can create detailed plans to actually go back to the normal that we know as soon as possible. But then there are two that are not happening yet, which is the reimagination of that next normal to build back better and to see what implications will be for the institutions, both public and private, on how to work, not only for the population as a whole. And reform. The UN indeed envisions a new wave of regulatory reform, so environments in industries remain competitive, but the protection of the most vulnerable populations remain a priority. Next, please. Here you see how the economy and the social aspects of the pandemic get intertwined. And next slide, please. And I need Sebastian to be next to me, if I may. I'm sorry that I'm saying this on the webinar, but Sebastian, if you can come, I will appreciate that. In the next slide, and I'm going to accelerate now because I'm running out of time, but we simply wanted to call your attention to the fact that there is this amalgamation. It is impossible to disconnect what happened in the social setting and in the economic setting. And that is important indeed, because some countries have been witnessing, now we need to go back to share the screen because I don't see it anymore, but it's okay. I was saying some countries have seen that somehow public policy on the economic side and public policy on the health issue on the social side are not necessarily correlated. The correlation is almost close to one. And this is no more than a call for the nations, for the public sector as a whole, to actually address better, especially in developing nations, that intertwine reality of public policy. The United Nations has recommended, of course, WHO leading the charge, while the United Nations has recommended how some social measures and how some economic policies take care, again, of the most vulnerable. That prioritization is very important, and we need to focus on it. And then we can go, Sebastian, now to the actual issue at hand, which is, of course, unconscious bias. And I wanted simply to introduce the concept after giving you an overview of what has been happening with the coronavirus pandemic and its effects so far. I simply wanted to tell you that unconscious bias remains a priority. Please go to the next ones. Give me the one on unconscious bias, because I would like the audience to see some definitions. But remains a priority because we have seen that some situations that existed before the pandemic actually are increasing. They have been exacerbated and discrimination happening when it shouldn't. And just to give you an example, a few months back, thank God that has now decreased, persons of Asian origin, you will remember this, persons of Asian origin or Asian look will immediately be discriminated, because people at the beginning associated this pandemic mostly with Asian, East Asia. And that is completely unfair and unacceptable. And we have evolved from that, but there you have an example of unconscious bias, because the brain, of course, processes information in a way, and fear is a fact of human life, and then it affects behavior. But if you look at the screen, allow me to begin with a very basic definition of bias, and then you will have the experts also going deeper into this. Bias is a prejudice in favor of or against one thing, person, or group compared with another, usually in a way that's considered to be unfair. Biases may be held by an individual, group, or institution and can have negative or positive consequences. There are conscious bias, of course, and unconscious bias, also known as implicit bias. And then, social stereotypes become important. The example that I gave you, there was a mixture of both, not only the geographical origin of the pandemic, the coronavirus coming from China, but also the stereotype that anyone looking Asian could be Chinese, which is not necessarily the case. And I say this with the most respect, of course, because everyone is exactly the same and has the same rights and responsibilities, and we are absolutely and adamantly committed against racial discrimination or any sort of discriminations. Next, please. And I think that is my last slide on unconscious bias. We need to also mention to the audience that there are indeed strategies to proactively address unconscious biases and instruments to assess unconscious bias. And you will hear the experts talking more about it, but just as a way of introduction, let me tell you that it would be always a good idea to promote self-awareness, to recognize one's biases. This is a personal decision that we should all make. I do it frequently using the implicit association test that we will discuss later on, or any other device for that sense. Then, to understand the nature of bias, the strategy of categorization that gives rise to unconscious bias is a normal aspect of human cognition and should be better understood. Then there are opportunities to have discussions with others, especially those from socially dissimilar groups, from people that you will find different from you in any way or another, not only racially. There are many other settings, of course. But sharing your biases can help others feel more secure about exploring their own biases. And finally, we suggest having facilitated discussions and training sessions in an institutional setting or even at home, because promoting bias literacy, utilizing the concepts and techniques that have been proven effective in minimizing bias will always remain a good idea. The implicit association test, IAT, as you see on the screen, is one of the most popular and well studied. It was developed as part of a project to detect unconscious bias based on several factors, including race, gender, sexual orientation, and national origin. It was developed as part of Project Implicit. You can just Google it, and you will see part of it is on Global Commons. That project, beautiful project, blended basic research and educational outreach in a virtual laboratory that allows users to examine one's own hidden biases and understand the stereotypes that exist below one's conscious awareness. So with that, allow me to conclude this introduction and now move on, and that's not necessary, Sebastian, thank you, to the next speaker. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce her. This is one of the most renowned experts that we know, Mrs. Smita Tharoor of India, but also British and living in London, who is the author of podcast series Stories of Unconscious Bias, is the founder of Tharoor Associates, which has a strategic alliance with the UN and with UNITAR, and as important is the co-founder of Culturelytics. So with that, dear Ms. Tharoor, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this webinar. The floor is yours. Can you hear me?
Yes. I was muted by Sebastian, now I've unmuted myself. Thank you so much, Alex. A very good introduction, very worrying introduction when you see the earlier slides on what is happening in the world, and that was very useful for me to understand it pictorially. So I appreciate that, and thank you also for giving us a small overview on what is unconscious bias, because that is what Ahmet, Tanya, and I are going to be talking about in relation to social inclusion and what we're going to be doing and how do we manage our unconscious biases. So when you kindly invited me to speak, I thought, okay, so what's the point of just talking superficially? I think it makes so much more sense if we can really address and understand how do we get these unconscious biases. Now, the next slide, which hopefully Sebastian is going to show, tells you exactly what Alex has already said to you, which is essentially, what is unconscious bias? It is a preference. What's interesting is the word bias alone, we have an unconscious bias connotation, this is my opinion, you may not have to agree with me, as being something negative. but it doesn't have to be negative. It is merely a preference. And of course, I wouldn't use the following sentence in normal conversation, but what if I said, when I wake up in the morning, I have a bias to start the day with a cup of tea? Well, it sounds weird because we don't normally speak like that, but technically there's nothing wrong in saying that. It's a preference for or against a person, thing, or group. And if you don't know that you have that implicit instinctive preference, then it's unconscious. And Alex mentioned something else earlier on, which I thought was interesting, where he talked about the phrase Asian and the fact that many people are against Asians. Now, Alex, because he works for the United Nations, is usually influenced by the United States. I live in the United Kingdom, in London. And the word Asian in the United Kingdom means somebody who looks like me. Whereas the word Asian in the United States means somebody who is Southeast Asian, could be Chinese or Vietnamese or you know, Japanese or so on. And there itself, it says something to me about what is unconscious bias. Because essentially, very simply put, how do we get unconscious biases? Because what's the point of talking about challenging our unconscious biases and exploring and becoming more emotionally intelligent and, you know, using different tools, which I have done, by the way, the implicit associate test, which I'll tell you about in just a minute, if you don't actually understand where it comes from to begin with. So when Alex was talking about the word Asian, which means different things to different people, depending on where you live, it says very simply put, and if you can just show me the next slide, it's very simply put, your narrative, your story, your experiences, and based on your experiences, you will have unconscious biases. So somebody living in the United States, so enormously influenced by the United States, and I say, hey, shut your eyes and visualize an Asian and describe to me, you will describe somebody who might look Chinese. And I can promise you, if there's anybody listening living in the United Kingdom, they're going to say, huh? What are you talking about? That one you just see on the screen, she's Asian. So do you see what I'm saying? So why have I shown you this particular picture? This was the only stock picture I could get of somebody wearing a backpack. It's not about the gender, it's about the backpack. And these are this is my phrase when I call it the backpack theory. You can call it whatever you like. But what I'm saying is, just go with me with this. So when you're born with this backpack on your back, okay? It's an analogy. And as you go through life, you chuck stuff into it. So you chuck things like, where are you born? How are you brought up? Parenting, friends that you make in school, those kind of different experiences. In addition, what you might instinctively throw into your backpack, and the reason you throw it in is to keep you safe, is difficult, traumatic experiences. None of us can judge what that trauma looks like, but some kind of difficult experience. It could be COVID-19, because that's what we're talking about. And because you have personally lost somebody, you know, somebody has died within your immediate family from COVID-19, you might throw that into your backpack and have an unconscious bias or an unconscious negative opinion of somebody who looks from Southeast Asia, could be Chinese or from there. So what we do is we have these experiences, we have this narrative, we don't realize that this narrative is influencing us. And so then what are we going to do about it, right? So I thought, let me just share some stories with you, because by sharing stories, it comes alive in terms of what I'm talking about. Certainly the one small example I can quickly add before I share the stories is what you mentioned about the implicit association test, which is created by Harvard University. And what was interesting is that I did one very recently. Now, as you rightly said, Alex, we've got 6 or 7 different categories, including race and gender and so on, but there's also age. And I assumed when I started out to do the test, because if I have to choose, do I see myself as old or young? There is no question, there is no ambivalence. I will see myself as old. My 28-year-old is young. I am old in that category. And therefore, I assumed that my unconscious bias when I complete the IAT would be that I have a positive bias towards old people. Well, lo and behold, guess what? I didn't. And the statistics prove that within the age category, that whether you see yourself as old or young, you instinctively have an unconscious positive bias towards young people. Anyway, I'm going to pause that. I only wanted to refer to it because Alex mentioned it. But let me just share 3 stories with you. 3 very different stories that show how we might be able to get unconscious biases. So story 1. These are all, by the way, true stories. I've had the privilege of, traveling around the world, speaking at conferences and so on, and people have shared their personal stories with me. This was in Philadelphia, and I was speaking at a conference there. And after the conference, a lady came to me to share her personal story with me. Now, she's of Italian origin, white American, looked, I'd say, give or take in her mid-30s. And she said to me that when she grew up in an extended family. In other words, parents, grandparents, uncles, aunts, cousins, and so on. While she was growing up, she found that it was a very patriarchal environment that she grew up in. And therefore, the women in the home, including her, didn't have much of a voice. So what did she do? And these are my words now, not hers. She threw it into her backpack. She threw it into her unconscious. She threw it into an area that she wasn't even aware of. And what she did is tried to protect herself from not being told off because she was trying to have an opinion or trying to make a voice or, have something to say within the family environment. Fast forward to today, and she is in a meeting. She often has something to contribute to the meeting. But guess what? Her unconscious bias has stopped her from opening her mouth. And when she was talking to me, she said, I've just realized why I have been not engaging within a team meeting. It's so deeply embedded in me that it became a normal that I don't speak up in groups. So there's one example. Another example, because I've only got 10 minutes and I've got to manage the time. Another example, let me think. As Alex very kindly said, I've created this podcast series on stories of unconscious bias, where I've interviewed people around the world, some of them who have never met and who have very kindly shared some amazing stories with me about their unconscious biases. But the one that I'm going to be every Friday is when I post it. So the one I'm posting tomorrow, I'm going to share very briefly one story that this particular person shares with me. Her name is Nina Bhandari, and she's a journalist and she lives in Sydney. And when she was 3, she had poliomyelitis. So in other words, she has a disability. But she is one of 3 sisters. And when she was brought up by her parents did not treat her any differently to her 2 siblings. You want to play basketball? Go play basketball. You want to lead a march band? You go lead a march band. I mean, it wasn't about, oh, poor thing, she's got a disability, we've got to protect her. It wasn't about that. So then what's in her backpack? Her backpack, because of her influence and her experiences, is one of feeling very comfortable in her own skin. Yes, she has a caliper. Yes, she has one leg that doesn't work as well as the other leg, but so what? So you see where I'm going with this. Unconscious biases come into our brains, into our backpacks because of our life experiences. And how else could they come? They could come from the media. So for example, I remember an ad that was banned in the United Kingdom last year. Now I'll describe the ad to you, and no marks for guessing why it was banned. So it starts off, it was for a Volkswagen electric car and how silent it is. So it starts off with a woman's hands putting clothes into a washing machine. Then it shows a woman's hands making sandwiches. Then it shows a man with one leg and a false leg winning a race in the Paralympics, I'm assuming. Then it shows a man in space, in a rocket. And then the final scene is a woman with a pram sitting on a park bench, and the Volkswagen drives past and they talk about how silent it is. So no marks for guessing. The ad was banned. But the point I'm making is, if it wasn't banned, we would have seen it, and without even realizing it, we would have embedded these stories as normal, that women do certain things and men do certain things. Let me just end by just sharing one more story, because I know that both Ahmet and Tanya are going to add a lot of value to what I've already said, because I just want to set the scene, so to speak. So I'm talking very specifically about how do we get unconscious biases? And then Ahmet is going to be talking about, so what does that mean and how are we going to become more emotionally resilient? And then Tanya is going to say, yeah, so then what? What are we going to do about it? So it kind of links one to the next. So I'll just share one more quick story with you and then pass it on to Ahmet to continue the storytelling. And let me just share a story about somebody who I heard in India. And this gentleman, when I don't remember how old he was, let's say he was in his mid-40s. And when he was about 10 or 12 years old, he was in school in what's called a whole school assembly. And so the whole school assembly means the parents are also invited. So all the children sit at the back and the parents sit in the front. And he, being a kid, as so many young children are, was getting bored. So he was taking little pieces of papers, crunching them up and then chucking them into the audience. Sadly, he got caught. He was pulled up onto the stage by the headmaster and he was made to kneel on stage for the rest of the assembly. Now, I can't even begin to think how traumatic it would have been for that young boy and the experience that he would have gone through. He chucked it into his backpack. Fast forward to today, he said to me, I realized somewhere along the line that I had a real problem with authority. I did not want to have a line manager. I just couldn't deal with authority. The good news in this story is that he was able to start his own successful business. Now, I've showed you 3 stories, which unfortunately, on reflection, are all not very positive stories, but there are many, many positive stories, and I'm sure we can all think about. You know, think about your best friend. If you've been to a multicultural school, say in London, which is where I live, the chances are you have met many, many nationalities. Think of your best friend, and I'm just for the context of this conversation, I'll say your best friend is from India. And then fast forward to today, and then let's imagine you're recruiting. The chances are that when an Indian comes in to be recruited, you're not Indian, obviously, in this story. Your unconscious positive bias, oh, he's Indian or she's Indian. I like that person. Why? Because this best friend that you've had for the last 30 years, 40 years, is somebody very close to your heart. And therefore, all things Indian is very close to your heart. So I hope you're understanding. I'm kind of having a whistle-stop tour just for 10 minutes to help you all understand where does bias come from? Because if we don't get to grips from where does bias come from, we really can't make any change in how we address it. But very last point before, I mean, you can show the last slide, Sebastian, because I don't have any more slides. But the very last point is that in terms of unconscious bias, what we have to understand is it is around us all the time. Right now, we're going through coronavirus. All of us are working from home. For those of you in heterosexual relationships who have young children, I would ask you, what kind of unconscious biases do you have? Both husband and wife working. You have little children, maybe 6 and 8, I'm visualizing. How does that work for you? What kind of role models are you showing to your children? Because guess what? Your children are learning it all. They're shoving it into their backpacks. So be careful how you behave in the home while your children are looking at you without they even realizing it. So that's it for the moment. I'm looking forward to hearing Ahmet and Tanya. Thank you very much.
Absolutely, Smita. Thank you for a very practical and interesting overview on the topic of unconscious bias. Very unique stories as well. Very good. We will continue in the way correctly portrayed by Smita with this narrative and analysis that hopefully you'll find interesting. Now with Professor Ahmet Aydemir, Professor of Business Administration at Bahçeşehir University in Turkey, and also the Director of CIFAL Istanbul, someone that is quite a privilege for us at UNITAR to have as a team member. With that, dear Ahmet, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Smita, for a wonderful presentation. I would like to salute all the participants, my colleagues, Smita and Tanya, and of course the UN representatives from Istanbul, Turkey, and hope that you are safe and in good health with your loved ones during these challenging times. Now, as Alex mentioned, the advent of the novel coronavirus, a pandemic that the majority of the world has not seen the likes of before, has affected all aspects of life in a very short time. And from the beginning of the pandemic, we are being bombarded with various facts and opinions on like how to survive this turbulent period, from medicines to vaccines to wearing a mask and not wearing a mask. So, and most of this information has been focusing on our physiology, our physical health, but our mental state is also under threat due to all of this uncertainty and the volatility of the global context of the pandemic. So at this stage, I would especially like to thank UNITAR and our esteemed panelists for actually initiating an event that focuses on not only the physical health, but also the mental health and psychologies during this period. I think this is being overlooked somehow, but it is as important as our physical health. So to protect our physical health, of course, during the first weeks of the pandemic, we focused on isolating ourselves to protect our physical and mental health to survive the pandemic. Obviously, that was understandable because to help others, we must help ourselves first. However, though the initial individual focus could have helped us in making us, more resilient towards the pandemic, in time, we somewhat became more self-centered and individualistic, and the ensuing decrease in the personal relations and social solidarity resulted in the widening of the socioeconomic and cultural gaps between different societies and countries. Next slide, please. The coronavirus has disproportionately devastated minority communities, from the severity of the infection and scale of the loss of the life to the catastrophic economic consequences for individuals and businesses, as Alex mentioned. And though these equalities are enshrined in law, in the practical world, the world is even more unfair and imbalanced than it was before, especially for those in disadvantaged situations. But obviously, as always, there's hope. The pandemic has shown us that regardless of how socioeconomically advantageous or superior we may be, our life is only as safe and healthy as that of the worst insured and least cared person in the society. In other words, the well-being and sustainability of nations depend on not the height of the ceiling, but the height of the floor. And it is time to raise the height of the floor now. As such, the world can only thrive if all of individuals and societies flourish proportionately. Next slide, please. Now, during the pandemic and also after the pandemic, we can only achieve proportionate global development through social inclusion. And to foster social inclusion, we must first become aware of the fact that we are global citizens and our home is not only our country, but also the planet we inhabit and everyone in it. We must show empathy and understanding towards others and take responsibility to enhance not only personal, but also societal and global prosperity. Finally, we should make sure that the good we do towards ensuring global prosperity is sustainable so that it becomes an inspiring habit for our peers and the next generations rather than just becoming a one-shot action. Obviously, what we're talking about is not easy to achieve, but there is something which I think will make it easier to be realized, and that is hopefully emotional intelligence. Next slide, please. Now, the official definition by Soloway and Mayer says that emotional intelligence is the ability to monitor one's own and other people's emotions, discriminate between different emotions and label them appropriately, and to use emotional information to guide thinking and behavior. Now, obviously, you might have heard other definitions since there are various categorizations and conceptualizations of the issue, the most famous one being that of Daniel Goleman. But the key aspects of the issue remain more or less the same within these different versions. Now, I will very briefly talk about that. Next slide, please. Now, emotional intelligence entails self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management. Self-awareness enables us to identify the emotions we feel and gives us an understanding, an initial understanding of why we feel those emotions. I would like to follow with the example that Smita gave. If you have lost someone to the virus or for other reasons, how do you feel? Like, do you feel sad because they're gone? Or do you feel sad because you didn't get to spend enough time with them? Or do you feel angry that they have left you alone? Or do you feel that now that death is a bit more realistic, do you start fearing death itself? So though this was a negative example, it is important to discern between the feelings themselves and to identify them, to name them, so that you know which one is more dense in different contexts, which ones come up in those unconscious bias situations, and thus allow you to take action to control them, which we come to then self-management. It helps us manage the emotions and use our awareness of emotions to initiate informed actions, decisions, and choices. Now, social awareness, after self-management, we come to social awareness. It's not enough that we are aware of our own emotions, but we need to understand the needs and necessities of others to show empathy towards their feeling and behavior. Now, one thing that we, as people, we mostly do is that we judge people not based on their actions, but based on their personality. So if someone does something that is, let's say, that you don't like, then you label that person, but not that the action. We need to consider the context and the time and the situation of that person. We need to show empathy in order to not judge the person by themselves. And of course, relationship management, the final stage, entails using the developed individual and social awareness to manage relationships in a solution-oriented and hopefully mutually beneficial manner. Next slide, please. Now, you can see here on the presentation that from self-assessment to emotional self-control to trustworthiness, conscientiousness, empathy, visionary leadership, and conflict management, there's a lot of competencies and skills involved with emotional intelligence. Now, the good news here is that these skills can actually be developed if they are worked on. But the not so good news is that they're a bit difficult to develop using pseudo-scientific pop psychology books. It rather needs investment and academic investment and also practical investments and training as well. Now, but obviously, since now that we know a little about emotional intelligence, let's get to the main topic. How do these competencies and how does emotional intelligence help us deal with unconscious biases? Next slide, please. Now, obviously, emotional intelligence has many advantages in dealing with unconscious biases and also in our daily lives and professional lives. But first of all, the awareness part is important. Learning about emotional intelligence lays the foundation for people to begin paying attention to what they think and how they view differences. It allows them to enhance inclusiveness in their thoughts and behavior. Now, understanding the strengths and weaknesses of yourself and of others and knowing how you feel about differences in others through self-awareness allows you to become conscious of any bias you might be harboring towards them. And once you become self-aware of any unconscious bias you might have, you can then try to find ways to adjust your thinking and behavior. So in any behavioral change, awareness is the first step. If you're not aware of it, then you cannot change it. But then, of course, you need action to change it, and then which comes to the management and regulation part. So self-management enables you to regulate how you react to situation. Now, as Smita and also Alex explained very well, unconscious bias occurs automatically as the brain makes quick judgments based on past experiences and background. Now, there are some cases that these biases are positive, but in other cases, these biases result in negative consequences. But self-regulation helps us avoid relying on stereotypes and making quick decisions. So we take our time and we put in the effort to consider the information, facts, and impacts on others so that we can minimize the effects of biases created by our initial impulses. Now, the next stage, empathy, it helps us tune into the feelings of others and better understand how our behavior affects them and how their behavior affects us. Showing empathy can build a sense of inclusiveness, which allows everyone to feel safe and to feel where they belong. This is especially important for environments where there are people from different backgrounds. You need to create a safe environment for them to think and speak freely. It is important, of course, for diversity because it allows us to understand other people and grow in awareness and relatedness to their point of view. When we become attuned to how we impact others, we become more motivated to recognize and minimize the effects of unconscious biases. Finally, flexibility, but I will detail this as cognitive flexibility and emotional flexibility, help us consider alternative approaches and opinions rather than just relying on our usual or typical methods. It allows us to embrace other perspectives and approaches and ensure that we reach optimal, mutually beneficial decisions. Next slide, please. The next slide, this is actually my last slide. I would like to here reiterate a quote by Aristotle. He says, anybody can become angry, that is easy, but to be angry with the right person and to the right degree and at the right time and for the right purpose and in the right way, that is not within everybody's power and is not easy. You can replace anger with any feeling that you have, positive or negative, it doesn't matter. But the feeling needs to be understood and it needs to be justified. So we harbor many feelings towards not only others, but also ourselves as well. And in order to control them as informed individuals, it is, I think, our responsibility and duty to separate feeling from facts. And we can only do that if we invest in developing our competencies of emotional intelligence. Now, as Smita mentioned, these are unconscious biases, but the fact that they're unconscious does not absolve us from inaction towards discriminatory behavior in our societies and around the world. On the contrary, it makes it more important to act against any kind of segregation by individuals, groups, organizations, and a society. Only this way we can overcome our differences and unite in action and thought to reach global social inclusion. We are all accountable and responsible to initiate the change we wish to see in the world. And to that end, as global citizens, I believe we must be committed to fostering a culture of inclusion and care where every community member feels supported and experiences a strong sense of belonging. My final words is that it is my sincere hope and wish that we as humanity learn from this experience of the pandemic and show resilience and solidarity towards discrimination and segregation to overcome our unconscious biases and reach global social inclusion in the hopefully foreseeable and near future. I thank all of you for listening and thank the UNITAR and BAU team for this organization, and thanks Smita and Tanya and all the other colleagues for joining in, and hope that with each coming day, the world becomes a healthier and more inclusive place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ahmet, for a very well structured presentation and quite interesting compliments that meet us very well. And I am sure that the next speaker will also add even more value to these conversations that we are having. And that will indeed be the right moment to introduce our colleague Tanya Hummel, Associate Executive Training at Globis Mediation. She is based in London, Mediation Group. She's based in London, and she's also our Senior Advisor on Leadership Development at UNITAR. Dr. Hummel has helped us a lot in training very senior government officials when it comes to understand leadership and personality, how personality traits, how your personality actually affects your leadership style, and several other things. She's an expert on Lumina Learning. She's going to explain that very soon. I'm part of Pride Coaching and Consulting. Without further ado, and to deliver a presentation entitled Unconscious Bias, how mindset and emotion drives behavior, I give the floor to Ms. Tanya Hummel. Welcome, Tanya.
Hello, everyone. Really pleased to be here. I take it you can all hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay. So just to give you a little bit of background about myself, I work part-time as a Director of People Engagement for a small charity. I also have my own business that runs leadership and coaching events. And at the same time, I work for as an associate for a couple of organizations, one of which is Globis Mediation Group. So immediately before this, webinar, I was coaching a director of surgery for a very large trust in the NHS, who was giving me a very frontline view on what life has been like for him and his 3,000 colleagues over the last few months. And it really has been quite extraordinary. So many thanks to Smita for her stories on unconscious bias, and to Ahmed on his work on emotional intelligence. So my perspective is really the so what question. So how on earth do we go about making the unconscious conscious? This is a favorite quote from Carl Gustav Jung, who said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Because when you are self-aware, you're really much more susceptible to your impulses, to your biases, and to your emotions. Next slide, please. So I've used a number of psychometrics. I like some psychometrics more than others. I like Lumina Learning's suite of psychometrics best of all, and these are the reasons. It's intelligent, it measures 3 personas. By 3 personas, your underlying self, your everyday self, and your overextended self. If you like, that's your private self, your public self, and your under pressure self, because we change in ways that we might not be completely fully aware of when we're under pressure. It's holistic, it embraces paradox. Why is that important? Because many psychometrics force the preference. You like to go to parties or you like to stay home and read a book. What happens if you're the sort of person who likes to go to parties and sometimes you want to read a book? So essentially it embraces paradox. You can be as complicated and paradoxical as you like. It's credible, it's based on the Big 5 research paradigm. So most psychometrics are based on Jung one way or another, but this also has Ocean Big 5 data behind it. And data, as we know, can be used for good or for evil. It's validated in terms of it has an enormous evidence base now. Many, many practitioners around the world and many people have actually used this tool. It's practical in its use of color. Now, why is that important? The reason that that's important is for some people, when they first see a tool that's used in color, they think that it's frivolous. It's not frivolous at all. There's a good, it's standing on the shoulder of giants. There's a good 100 years of psychology behind this tool in terms of Jung and Freud, and of course the ancients in terms of how they looked at personality. And of course, as I said recently, the Ocean Big 5. So essentially what we're talking about now is a transformed individual is one who can tell the truth. Oh, you keep flipping. Can you go back a couple of slides, please? Oh, yes, you're back. Okay. So essentially what we're saying is that this particular tool is practical in that the use of color makes it memorable. It also doesn't stereotype, and there's a variety of uses and ways that it shows information. Next slide, please. So this is a quote that's, that is my learned experience, in fact, that as a transformed individual, you might think yourself to be very self-aware. You might think that you're very aware of all of your biases, but you may well be working in an environment in which the truth cannot be told. People are very defensive about their biases. They like to believe that what they think is right. And as we've seen, we're in an ever more divided world where people have difficulty in listening and are too busy shouting over each other. So I like this quote because it essentially shows that at the individual level, you need to transform yourself. At the environment level, you need to transform the environment. And that's really what people like me do, what leadership development does, what coaches do. Next slide, please. So Lumina's 4 principles are very much in line and similar to what Ahmet was saying earlier. The foundation of it all is self-awareness. What are my preferences? Then you go to what are other people's preferences? And then you understand how to build rapport with people who are different to you. And so it's not just a matter of differences in race or gender or religion. It's also differences in the way we take in and process information. And once we understand that people generally have good intentions, they're just coming from a different perspective than you are, and you understand what that perspective is, you're better able to adapt and connect with them. Next slide, please. So as an example, this is from the Lumina Splash app. We have 2 individuals right here. So what do we see when we look at them? We see that actually they've got some things in common. They have some things not in common. So they are both fairly outcome focused, and that would be tough, competitive, and logical. So that long, thin streak on the red means that that person is likely to be quite strong in one dimension, not in all 3. if we look at the outcome focused in the person on the left, we will see that theirs is a bit shorter and a bit fatter. So chances are that they cover more than one of those particular aspects. We can also see that they're both people focused. Well, that's good news. They're accommodating, they're collaborative, and they're empathetic. So if I were to go into an organization to say, I want to talk to you about unconscious bias, chances are they'd be very interested because they are quite people focused. The difference though, when we're looking at it, is in terms of the discipline driven and the inspiration driven. So people who are very discipline driven, they like to be purposeful, they like to be structured, they like to be reliable, they set goals and they meet them. So that's the person on the left. If you're looking at the person on the right, not so much. Adaptable, flexible, and spontaneous. So talking to this director of surgery earlier, he was describing an environment where people were very used to process, protocols, targets, goals that had been thrown up in the air as a result of COVID, and everybody had to move towards being much more inspiration driven, much more adaptable, flexible, and spontaneous. The rules went out the window because saving people's lives from COVID was paramount. And the question for him is, how do we now get them back? So we can see immediately from these two individuals that if I was going in to have a conversation with them, I would be tailoring my approach to the one on the left who would be very down to earth and saying, okay, how do I do this? Tell me what to do, tell me when to do it by. And the person on the right who would be saying, actually, equality and inclusion, diversity, these are big issues. We need to let the goals evolve. It happens over time. It's not going to happen immediately. So different perspectives, same group. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we have the model itself, and the model is at the superficial level quite simple. It is actually very complicated. So if you are used to things like Myers-Briggs, you will be able to see that on the inner circle where thinking is outcome focused, feeling is people focused, and so on. So that's an oldie and a goodie that most people in the world know. Then we have the outer rim, which looks at the Lumina model, discipline-driven, inspiration-driven, and all of those good things. But you can also map to the Ocean Big Five. Now, what is the Ocean Big Five when it's at home? O is for openness to experience. That's the yellow side. That it basically covers the quality of being conceptual, imaginative, and radical. Its opposite, if you're not actually that open to experience, you're much more likely to be down to earth. And that will be, you'll be practical, you'll be evidence-based, and you'll be cautious. So we've got openness to experience, we've got conscientiousness, which is represented by the purple. The people who actually get things done. They're productive and they're orderly. And then of course you've got extroversion. To what extent are you extrovert? To what extent are you introverted? And agreeableness. So this is essentially mapped to the Ocean Big Five. The part that's missing from this screen, next screen please, is neuroticism. So if I were to say to Smita, my dear, you are so neurotic, chances are she's not going to thank me for it. She'll be quite insulted. But actually, in terms of neuroticism, that is one of the 5 factors in the Ocean Big Five. And neuroticism is important. How does Lumina tackle the question of neuroticism? It does so in the overextensions. So if you look at the model and draw a line down more or less the middle at an angle, you will see on the right the behaviors that are associated with dopamine. So people who are much more positive towards risk-taking, much more motivated by reward, they will tend to go here when they are overextended. They become domineering, overbearing, forceful, controlling, chaotic, and argumentative. On the other side of the wheel, much more related to serotonin. When you lack serotonin, you can be depressed, which is why we have SSRIs. And here we have the behaviors that are associated with being overextended. So you might become submissive, withdrawn, apprehensive, pessimistic, inflexible, or avoidant. So those is one aspect of how they tackle neuroticism. Next slide, please. Next slide. Right. So then, Lumina does something very interesting. If Lumina Spark covers behaviors, then Lumina Emotion goes to the heart of neuroticism. What they do in the first instance is they look at the emotional sparks and they say, this is the mindset essentially of that may well be driving the behaviors. So if you're in Lumina Spark, if you're accommodating and collaborative and empathetic because you're very people focused, it may well be simply because you have a high regard for others. There it is. On the red scope, you might be more independent of others. So you don't actually mind a really good fight. So that's all very interesting in and of itself. On the right-hand side, though, we start to get to a level deeper. To what extent are you a cool reactor or a hot reactor? Now, this isn't something that you can necessarily help. It's to do with your amygdala. Your amygdala in terms of how big it is, how active it is. Some people have very small, very quiet amygdalas. We call them psychopaths. Some people have very big amygdalas that are constantly reacting to stimuli, seeing threat everywhere. And for those people, it can eventually turn out to be anxiety or depression or all kinds of mental illness. But ultimately, there are things that you can do about it. In terms of the Ocean Big Five, neuroticism is the aspect that is most amenable to therapy. But let's take a closer look at neuroticism, because Lumina don't even like the term neuroticism. In terms of leadership, we've gone for a very, we've gone for what I like to imagine as the Clint Eastwood school of leadership, where we're confident and we're optimistic and we're resilient and we're even-tempered and we're very stoic and we never show our emotions. And it's always been the case that women in particular have been accused of being too moody or being too vigilant or being too modest. But actually all of those qualities have their uses. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we have Lumina emotion reactors. And remember what I said at the start of the conversation about the underlying, the everyday, and the overextended. Well, what we have here in one model is the underlying and the everyday and the overextended. Because underlying, you may well be impassioned. And that means that you feel your emotions quite deeply. And when you come to work, you may well be quite mood intense, you may be fiery, and ultimately, if you're overextended, you will be volatile. People will be walking on eggshells around you. Similarly, if you are optimistic, you look on the bright side, the glass is half full, and you will be positive and you will be upbeat. But here is an interesting case in question. If we look at the UK's Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, I think most people would agree that in terms of the Roundheads and the Cavaliers, he is much more of the Cavalier disposition, and he is a glass half full kind of guy. When the coronavirus outbreak broke out, he was criticized for not going to the COVID meetings, and instead he went to the hospitals and he said, it's all fine. And he shook hands with everyone and told everyone that he was shaking hands with COVID patients included. And next thing you knew, he ended up in intensive care. By contrast, let's take a look at his counterpart at the other side of the world, Jacinda Ardern from New Zealand. And actually, we can see immediately that she is probably a lot more vigilant. And because she's more vigilant, she would be apprehensive and concerned. A virus is coming. I'm going to take action. And then using Lumina Spark, if we wanted to do that, we could say she took action very early. She took charge. She said, it is not acceptable for us that a single person from New Zealand should die of this. And we're going to go early and we're going to go hard. And as a result of her more pessimistic point of view, she's ended up with one of the lowest COVID rates in the world. And as a result of Boris's more optimistic points of view, he's ended up with one of the highest rates in the world. Now, that's not entirely fair. It's also to do with geography and, you know, all of the other factors that have come into it. But this is just an example of how underlying emotion and mindset can drive behavior and cause consequences for good or ill. Next slide, please. Okay, so with the Lumina portraits, essentially what happens is typically, if I'm doing a group, I will do their portraits in advance. I will be able to map the whole organization. And from mapping the whole organization in the team viewer, I will see the commonality between the people in the organization. So say, for example, at the charity that I work for, we have a lot of down-to-earth, very blue and green people. They are pragmatic, they're practical, they're empathetic. They're not going to be carried away with visions of the future or loveliness. So I'm not going to be able to persuade them with simply using inspiring stories. They want facts. Now, when we actually look at their Lumina Spark portraits, they will get a page like this that shows their qualities, underlying, everyday, overextended. Now, this is actually the Lumina Emotion page. So from the Lumina Emotion page, you can see things like this particular individual, underlying, quite skeptical of others. So their non-judgmental score is actually quite low. Then we look at the everyday side. They've changed behavior completely. So instead of being very red in that aspect, they've put a lot of energy into understanding others. But what it also does is it creates an overextension where they become people-pleasing. So they're not actually giving in to their skepticism of others. Instead, they're trying maybe a little bit too hard to be understanding of others, and as a result, being people-pleasing and ending up a bit drained. Similarly, if we actually look down at some of the other areas, we can see very strongly with the pink aspects that they've got more hot reactor qualities to them than cool reactor qualities. Now, the other thing that I think is useful to point out is that where underlying and everyday it's imbalanced, that's a good thing. But with some of the qualities, they'll be suppressed or they'll be amplified. And I'll give you an example. I was doing a coaching session for a young Black woman, and we were talking about recent events, and we were going through her portrait, and she was looking at some of her suppressions. And she turned to me and she said, I don't know if it's okay to say this, but I think actually it's partly because of the whole situation around race that this is actually affecting my mindset, my emotions. And we talked this through, and as a result of that, I'm about to do a program for our equalities and diversity program. And one of the things that Lumina is going to help me with is basically assessing where we are and trying to understand how the various groups in the organization experience the organization from a recruitment point of view, from a reward point of view, from a promotion point of view. How is their experience of the organization the same or different to other groups? And in that sense, we'll have the data to take very targeted action. And like I say, you know, not everybody uses these kinds of tools. For me, the tool isn't an end in itself, but it underpins most of the qualities I have, simply because whether it intends to do this consciously or not, it creates a safe space for people to explore the colors, to explore the bar charts, to explore the app in a way that gets them talking and sharing. And that, to me, is the first sign of success. I think that's the end.
Thank you very much, Tanya. Let me just add something to what you say, because I have tried, as you know, with you mainly, in practical terms, this methodology, beautiful toolkit called Lumina Learning, and also now I see Lumina Emotions as a little more new for me. And I can tell you this, this all starts, Tanya mentioned this just in passing, with a personality test. If you go and you try to know yourself better, and you actually take the time to answer some questions and so on, there is a software that Tanya is explaining the model behind the software that actually tells you, you know, you are like this or that, and then the idea is to receive coaching and so on. So I wanted just to give you the overview of what you have just seen, because, and this is perhaps to go back to the issue of unconscious bias, your personality, our personality, affects unconscious bias greatly, is perhaps the biggest factor in this sense. So if you get to know yourself a little better in the way that Tanya has expressed using this model or any other model for that sake, perhaps it would be easier, I go now to Ahmet, to develop self-awareness, because emotional intelligence has to come from self-awareness. So you can control your emotions and you don't react, and your unconscious bias is not so obvious and negative in a sense. But then I go back to Smita and her stories and her beautiful introduction. All of this is because during the COVID and without the COVID, before and after the COVID, we will always have it. And this beautiful theory of hers of the backpack indeed affects you, because your personality is affected by the backpack, right? Or whatever the name you want to use to this baggage, as she's saying. We grow up, we go through this process that involves emotions, experiences, some negative, some positive, and then we are who we are today. So the more that we know us, the better that we can do. The old Greek proverb that says, what is the most important thing in life? And the answer, which is to know thyself, to know us. So let's go back to unconscious bias. Thank you again, Tanya. Thank you again, Ahmet, and thank you again, Smita, for a beautiful overview of what unconscious bias properly is, what emotional intelligence is, and then a practical model to actually get to understand your personality better and your personality traits and your behavior. On unconscious bias proper, and before we open the floor for some questions that we have received, I'm going to read them out loud, so any of you feel free to answer any of the panelists. Unconscious bias, I need to add just one more thing. It is very important and a priority of the United Nations, because we are committed for a long time now on avoiding discrimination, harassment, and the like. And we have multilateral instruments, and that's where I want to go. The Human Rights Council actually has been very active in promoting the rights of persons that, for whatever the reason, are minorities, vulnerable populations, or so-called different. Nobody's different. We are all different. But from the point of view of the United Nations, from the point of view of this United Nations agency, UNITAR, we all need to pay attention to the need to build capacity, to train us to do it officially and formally, not only with government people, but with anyone in civil society. But I think it's a personal decision. It's more than institutional in this sense. There are so many instruments of legislation, regulations, best practices that we can understand, that then can guide us in making a personal commitment to actually better understand unconscious bias, so we don't do it. Transformation begins with one, you, myself. So with that, let me read some of the quite interesting questions that we have received. I'm going to go in chronological order. We have unfortunately only 12 minutes, or let's say 15, but we must address these excellent questions. Some of them I'm just going to read, are more of comments, but then please feel free to answer any of you. So it says, and I guess this is for Tanya, how is unconscious bias linked to personality traits? So while you prepare your answer, Tanya, or anyone, I have another one that I guess will go to Smita. Can unconscious bias be unlearned? Quite interesting question. The next one would be, can institutions be unconsciously, in parentheses, what a beautiful question, can institutions be unconsciously biased by design? How to address this? I would love to have some comments on that. I don't know many things in life, but I do know about public policy and about the public sector. And then there is a comment that I would like to read. Disabilities are not only physical, they are sensory, intellectual, and psychological. It is important not to miss out invisible disabilities on the background of more visible disabilities. I guess this one is one of the implicit bias here, which are often physical. So for any of you that would like to address that, and you or the speakers, you can also see the questions and answers if you simply click at the bottom. But then another one says, I do not have a problem with the backpack. Anybody can have as heavy a backpack as you want to have. My problem is when a person starts sending things from his or her backup to me. Then my question is how to stop an individual doing that? What would be my best response to counter it? How to plan it and evaluate it, and how that will work. So for Ahmet also, any question that we have mentioned or comment that you would like to address is very good. But I have one perhaps more adapted to you. It says, I want to make a link between retrospective studies and bias. In the field of research, is it conscious or unconscious biases? I think you talk about studies. What the person is saying that his or her question is based on that, on the field of research. Is it a conscious or unconscious biases? You can see that question, Ahmed, and I hope I'm not confounding you, but please address it if you want. Let me stop there, and we have some others at the bottom. But would you like to
like us to address this, Alex? Shall we? I'm just trying to think in the interest of time, because you've got 9 minutes. Perhaps each of us can answer one of your questions, because you've asked about 7 questions, I think, or around that.
And you don't need to answer all of them, but yes, choose one of them.
I think that might be the rest. And I'm just very quickly looking through the questions.
Just one second, Smita, before you begin, and I have some news for you. On this one, I will have to be the bad cop, and you can be unconsciously biased against me. In 60 seconds, I'm going to stop you. So you have 1 minute to address whatever you want to address, a question or a comment, and then I will stop you.
First, I've got to find the question, because you asked 7 questions, and I can't remember which one I'd like to.
I will remind you question. Is can unconscious bias be unlearned? But that goes after Tanya. Tanya goes first. Tanya, do you remember your question? How is unconscious bias linked to other personality traits?
Go on, go for it, Tanya. 60 seconds.
Well, absolutely. I think when people do the Lumina portrait for the first time, they're usually delighted and amazed, because there are some qualities that show up that they were aware of. There are other qualities that show up that they were completely unaware of. And usually they're pleasantly surprised or maybe a little shocked. And what I always recommend is that they go and they show their profile to somebody who knows them really well, to say, this is a self-report. You answered the questions. Did you answer the question wrong? Or more likely, is this simply a blind spot? And usually they go to their husbands, their wives, their partners, or their children, and they will say, yes, absolutely. I've been trying to tell you for years, this personal quality is something that I see in you, but you've never recognized in yourself. So that's what we mean by making the unconscious conscious. It's really the Socratic method, isn't it? We ask the questions until we get to the answer. And then when we get the answer, we hold that answer up to the light and we examine it. So when you have your Lumina portrait, not only do we see your patterns of behaviors and, in Smita's words, your preferences, but we're also able to go under the skin of what's caused those preferences. What are the situations, the cultural heritage, the circumstances that have caused you to have those beliefs about yourself and of others? I hope that's useful.
Indeed, and it was exactly a minute and 2 seconds or so in my so much. So indeed, personality traits greatly affect unconscious bias. And now we go to Smita to address the question, can unconscious bias be unlearned? Smita.
Of course they can be unlearned, but they can only be unlearned if you're actually self-reflecting. And that's why I was talking about what I call the backpack theory, because there's some things that you don't consciously or unconsciously want to unlearn, because it might be a very difficult traumatic experience. On the other hand, if you've been brought up as a young child to avoid a particular group of people or a particular sexuality or something, you can as an adult reflect on that and say, hang on, that's a bit silly of me. And that was an unconscious bias, and of course I should unlearn that. So the short answer is yes, you can unlearn it. The longer answer, or the more difficult answer, is it's about reflection, it's about being brave, it's about genuinely reflecting and understanding what is your narrative and how are you influenced unconsciously. Have I fitted your 60 seconds?
I was 45.
Oh, good for me.
Ahmed, any of the questions that you would like to address? You're muted.
Yes, of course. So there's one question that says academia is failing to understand the stress of coronavirus on academics and research. Now, I would like to make a comment on that. Not only academia, but I think the whole situation is a bit unclear, because everybody is expecting people to have some spare time and to be more productive in that time. But I believe that nobody's ideal conditions of being productive are where people continue becoming sick and even dying outside, and you try to manage work and life at the same time with that crisis. So I think we should give people some space as a breathing space to let them realize that this is not a normal situation, and though it is temporary, we don't know when it will end.
Indeed, and thank you. So let me go to the next set of comments and questions. The first one, I'm going now from the bottom up. I began from the bottom down. The one that just arrived says, thank you for this great opportunity. My experience, COVID-19 has aggravated a lot of biases.
I agree.
How to initiate a conversation with people? How can I initiate a conversation with people and make them become more aware of their biases without offending them, especially during this emotionally charged time? Who would like to address that?
It's kind of connected to what Prit Kaur said earlier on as well, where she says, I do not have a problem with the backpack. Anybody can have as heavy a backpack wants to have, but my problem is when other people start putting their stuff on me. So it's, in my opinion, they're both very linked. And I would say it's actually about open, honest conversation. When somebody is emotionally charged, it's very hard to make them understand their own biases. You only put them on the defensive by pushing them against a wall and saying, hang on, think, listen, reflect. It's not going to work. It's about timing. It's about chatting. It's about being honest in how you communicate. It probably sounds naive and idealistic, but actually works. And I know because I've tried it.
Indeed. Now, going up again from the bottom, the next one says as follows. Can we build a new social method to correlate and cooperate within the community to cease social discrimination to people affected by such diseases? Talking of someone infected of the coronavirus. Yes, Ahmet.
So I definitely believe that we can. Actually, there have been very innovative methods to deal with this social crisis. In quarantine times, for example, old people put post-its outside of their houses to state what they needed, and young people who were able to go out, went out and bought it for them. Also, there are new applications like neighborhood applications in which you write your need, and then the people who can actually support that give you that need. One was actually in Turkey, where because of the virus, people with low socioeconomic statuses couldn't pay their bills. So what the government did was that they put up a site and they said, if you want, you can pay other people's bills just by going on that site and using your own resources. So there's a lot of collaborative and new methods for dealing with these crises.
Thank you very much. I'll read the next. I wanted to ask if these unconscious biases we have of people may link to how we form our identities and belonging ourselves. I believe this is important to think about, considering our loyalties could be connected to various things from citizenship right to discrimination against certain people. We are programmed in a way, of course. May I know the thoughts of any of the panelists on this, how unconscious biases come from our identity and belonging? Any comment? Yes, Smita.
I wasn't sure whether people want to respond. But no, I mean, I'm just kind of reinforcing what I've already said. Our identity is an enormous influence on how we respond in terms of our unconscious biases. I mean, one of the interviews that I did in my podcast recently is of a gentleman who's fairly well-known in the United Kingdom. He's of Indian origin and he's a well-known musician. His name is Nitin Sawhney. And he says very briefly, when one of the things that he says is that I had such enormous racist abuse that I was ashamed to call myself Indian. I just happened to read an article today, and I cannot for the life of me remember the name of the writer, where he talks about the fact that he's Black. And when he goes to work, he has a different persona when he is at work and a different persona at home. Why is that? Because he says, when I'm at work, even though you can see that I'm Black, and I'm proud that I'm Black and I'm proud of my identity and my heritage, but I don't talk about it because I am not as easily included within the place of work. And so identity is very, very important And if we, and I'm being very simplistic here, and I'm sure Ahmed, who's a professor of psychology, will add more to what I'm just saying. But if we are able to be confident, very simply put, in our own identity, then we can manage our own conscious or unconscious biases better. If we are not feeling confident in our own identity, I am not happy to be Indian because I have been, had enormous racist abuse, as Nitin Soni says in the podcast. Or I am not happy to be Black because I go into work and I am treated differently. Then how is it that you're able to, you will automatically protect yourself. You'll shove it into your backpack, and that will then create unconscious biases. I mean, it's a big, big question, which requires a long answer, and I'm trying to summarize it. Ahmed, you're nodding away. I'd love for you to add to that.
Yeah, so I would definitely agree on the importance of identity. I would just like to mention that it is important to discern which identity we're talking about. The one at home, the one we post on social media, the one at work, the one with where we are friends. That is, I think, the most difficult part. Like each identity differs in itself, and especially the one on social media differs a lot from all of the others because it is what we want to project. So it's very difficult for a person to choose which identity he or she wants to embrace. I think that's the main point. It becomes a bit easier after that. If you're aware of which identity you want to embrace, then it's easier to see the problems with that and to work on them to solve them.
Thank you. And the last question that I'm going to present goes to Tanya, but to give her some time to prepare her thoughts, I'm going to address the one that I actually was going to address. So the question will be the one on top, the first one that we got from Dr. Mohammad Tariq Tesar, that says, what should we expect in a post-pandemic world in terms of unconscious bias? Are we ready, right? And while you think about it, Tanya, I will address question number or comment number 4. That says, can institutions be unconsciously biased by design? Institutions, now not the individual. How to address this? The answer is yes, of course it is. I'm originally from Ecuador in Latin America. I had the privilege of being a diplomat for Ecuador, and I served with my government at the Ministry of Economy and Finance and so on and so forth. I do remember that this is several years ago, that it took a while for a Latin American government like ours to actually go to gender balance. And gender balance, the route to gender balance, implied something rather difficult. Today, I'll give you an example of something that is happening as of last year here in Geneva. Around 16, 17 years ago, we already had like 4 or 5 years of a campaign to basically ensure that anyone in the public sector in my country had the same rights as long as a meritocracy, at least in theory, to advance, no matter the gender, right? But then we discovered in one of the trainings, government-wide trainings that we engaged, that there is this unconscious bias. At the time, we didn't call it like that, but it is unconscious bias because our culture affects us so much. And you will think that men are good to do certain things in the public sector and women are not so good to do that, but they are good to do others. That type of thing led to an initiative within our institutions called avoiding, I'm translating from the Spanish, casual discrimination. Fast forward, last year, the year before last, here in Geneva, at the United Nations in Geneva, I was so happy to see, institutionally speaking, that UNOC, the United Nations office in Geneva, they had launched before something called gender champions on gender equality and women advancement. But then they launched a campaign within that campaign called casual sexism. Casual sexism. So I happened to link what I saw a few years back with what I saw today. And my first reaction was, well, we haven't really advanced. When you come to Switzerland, you think here things are pretty much balanced. Women are really not unconsciously discriminated and so on. But this campaign was founded on the promise that sometimes, and I'll use the most basic of examples, you don't want to discriminate. You don't want to be unconsciously biased. You just react like that. And even if you don't react, you just think like that. The basic example to be neutral, not within the UN, I don't want to be improper, is when you are driving. And perhaps you react differently if you see a female driver or a male driver. That has been researched. In some countries it's less, in others it's more. that also happens at the office. And an organization has a lot to do in terms of research to diagnose what is happening, a lot to do in terms of setting policies and regulations and administrative instructions on how to behave, what is acceptable, what is not. And more important than that, number 3, which is the example that I'm giving you of several years back in this Latin American government or here at the United Nations in Geneva, you can raise awareness about it. So it becomes a personal decision, and everyone working in this institution helps to transform it. Because to conclude, institutions, people tend to think are the buildings or the legislation behind it, and this amalgamation of brick and mortar. It is not. An institution is the people there, and the people behind us, the ones that we inherited or put in place the things that we inherited, and the ones that will come after that. So there you have an example. An institution indeed needs to recognize that and then avoid being biased by design. It's a dynamic process, and we must strive in doing this thing at the institutional level. And to conclude, let me go again back to Tanya. How is it going to be, Tanya? What to expect in a post-pandemic world?
Well, thank you so much, Alex, for giving me such a small question. It's obviously a one-word answer. What to expect in a post-pandemic world? Are we ready? No, we're not ready. We're never ready for anything. We weren't especially ready for this pandemic. All we have done so far that I can see is react. I'm okay with this because I think the world isn't perfect. It never was. It never will be. But we are seeing some interesting signs. And I think to some extent it depends on whether you're optimistic or pessimistic. So in the political sphere, particularly in Britain, you're seeing Tories acting as socialists and issuing helicopter money and bailouts for businesses and for individuals. That is pretty much unheard of. It was always the fact that the opposition had the magical money tree. So I'm rather amused to find that, yay, they found it. So we're busy putting money into the economy and business. I think that's what makes it slightly different from the financial crisis, where the financial crisis, it was bailing out the banks and austerity for everyone. Now we've actually discovered the limits of austerity, and that austerity actually eventually affects everyone. I think technology has really come to the forefront. So for example, with the charity that I work with young disabled people, actually part of the reasons that they found it so difficult to be employed is because they couldn't get to places that weren't suitable for them, not through the transports, not through the buildings. Whereas now, working at home, they've opened up a lot more opportunities. So I think the technology revolution continues. I think in terms of the economies, it has already had a major impact. But I think the lasting question is, how much do we actually need? And do we want to go back to being a full-on consumer society where GDP is the only thing that matters? I think some of those questions that have been really marginalized have actually gone mainstream now, and from the most unexpected quarters. I think going back to our question of conscious or unconscious bias, as much as it seems to me that the world is in a very bad mood with lots of anger and upset, I think we are finally having conversations about things that matter. And I hope that this is the human race going through its rather problematic adolescence, hopefully to come out the other side with a bit more maturity and a bit more concern and a lot more empathy, I hope, because I think that's been something that's been in short supply over the last decade or so.
Thank you so much, Tanya, for that holistic mind of view. Indeed, excellent comments that help us here. And we have run out of time because we have received even more comments and questions, but I think I should read the last because it goes to all of you. It says, thank you for a wonderful webinar, wonderful presentations and discussions. Thoroughly enjoyed. I am Preet Kaur, Associate Professor of Criminal Justice at Auburn University at Montgomery, Alabama in the USA. So thank you to all of you, including you, Professor. We have had 80-some people now, a little less in the Zoom. webinar, but also Facebook Live, several hundreds with Facebook Live and also YouTube. So on behalf of UNITAR, please receive our appreciation for having joined us today, and particularly to the speakers, always our recognition and our gratitude to all of you. With that, we wish you the best, and we conclude this webinar. Thank you, and bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.